This is the Gun Owners News Hour with the latest news about threats to your liberty and your right to keep and bear arms. Our guests include elected and other public officials, journalists, citizen activists, and others who are fighting for the Bill of Rights, especially the Second Amendment. The Gun Owners of America News Hour covers a wide range of constitutional issues, particularly the debate over private ownership of firearms. Our host is Larry Pratt, Executive Director of the Gun Owners of America. Remember, the issue is not just about gun control, it's about control. Now, here's your host, Larry Pratt.
Welcome to this edition of the Gun Owners News Hour. Thank you for joining with us. Today, we're going to be speaking Brian Aitken. If you're familiar with the perils of Pauline, we could have something similar, the perils of Brian. This was just a never-ending torture that Brian Aitken endured in the state of New Jersey, primarily because he was a gun owner. And it's just jaw-dropping to see the extent to which he was run through the ringer for doing nothing more threatening than moving his household goods from one abode to his new abode. And for that menacing action, it was a world of hurt. And it, I think, exemplifies what is wrong with gun control. Brian was not menacing anybody. He was not committing any crime. He was doing what hundreds of people do every day in this country, probably thousands, moving himself in his car. And nevertheless, he ended up doing a fair amount of time in the clink. And it's just amazing that there are people in government, and in this case in New Jersey, which seems to be particularly anti-Second Amendment, that would take a man and ruin his life because he had guns. They weren't in any. I would say, Brian, you weren't carrying those guns probably any differently from, say, somebody that might have been moving his set of golf clubs. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. I mean, I was moving them alongside everything that I owned: my books, pots and pans, clothes. They were just, one more thing that I owned.
I guess the biggest problem that underlay your whole situation was your mom had been concerned about your state of mind. You were going through a divorce, and you had made a statement which she took wrong. If I recall correctly, I wish I weren't here. Well, you were referring to the great state of New Jersey. By the way, I grew up in New Jersey, and all I can say is I am happy that I am from New Jersey. My hat's off to you guys that are living there behind enemy lines, because it is not a friendly environment. It's a socialist mentality that thinks that the government really does us a favor by all their over-regulation. And man, did that cost you a lot of trouble, cost you a lot of money and time out of your life. Why don't you just describe what got you to the point where your mom made that call, which led to, well, actually, she didn't make the call. She hung up, if I'm not mistaken, but nevertheless, they knew, 9/11 knew who had made the call, what number had made the call, and I guess that sort of started the dominoes falling. But before we get to that point, just get us to the dangerous activity that you were embarking upon before you said, I wish I weren't here.
I go into great detail about this in the book, but essentially I had just traveled. I just flown in 3 days earlier. So I had TSA clearance to fly with my firearms. I had called the New Jersey State Police to find out how do I transport my firearms once I'm there. And I was driving to my parents' house to move into a new apartment. And on the way there, I got a text message from my wife, now my ex-wife, letting me know that for the fourth week in a row, she was canceling my visitation with my son. Now, I had only moved to New Jersey to be closer to my son, who was only about a year old at the time, from Colorado. We'd lived in Colorado. My son was born in Colorado. We had a house in Colorado. The week before this was January 2nd, 2009, was Christmas, and she had canceled Christmas, too. And we spent several hours, my mom and I, waiting for my infant son to show up, and she never did. And we were worried. We didn't know if they'd been in a car accident. We called, and we sent text messages, and we didn't hear anything back until the next day. And this was a similar scenario. She was canceling for the fourth time in a row. And while I was packing up my car with literally everything that I owned, I asked my mom, what the heck is the point of being here? here as in New Jersey if I can't see my son? And she was a trained social worker, and she thought, after I had left, about 15 minutes after I left, she thought, what could he have meant? So she called 911, immediately hung up the phone, and by that point it was too late.
I guess their policy is they're sending somebody out even if it's a hang-up.
Yeah, and I can understand that. Somebody calls 911, and if you're being robbed and the robber gets control of the phone and they hang up the phone, a policy like that makes sense. But once they got there, one of the first things they asked my mom was, does he own guns? It wasn't how is he, what's going on, it was does he own guns? And my mom answered yes.
Alternatively, does he own a couple of bottles of aspirin?
Well, eventually they searched my car for 3 hours, and they didn't care about my ice axes for ice climbing or the 400 feet of climbing rope that I had. Had they really been concerned about my well-being, they probably would have, taken those things aside, but they had no problem with any of that.
Interesting. And so, by the way, little nicety that comes up in the Fourth Amendment was not observed by the police on this.
No, it was very frustrating. They had told me that my mom had placed an abandoned 911 call, and they asked me to return to my parents' house so that they could allegedly check me for bruises to make sure that I hadn't been assaulted. And I thought that was one of the most disingenuous things that I'd ever heard. My mother is maybe 95, 100 pounds, and the most caring woman I've ever met in my entire life. So the idea that they wanted to check me for bruises just didn't seem authentic. So I asked if I was legally required to come back, and the police officer said no. So I said, okay, I'm not going to come back then. And I got off the phone with them, and about a minute later, they called me back and told me they'd issued a statewide general alert, and that if I didn't come back immediately, every police officer in the state was going to be on the lookout for the make and model of my car, and I could either come back the easy way or the hard way, in the police officer's words.
Do you think they had actually put out such an alert, or was that just a con to get you back?
There is record of them issuing a general alert, so they actually did do that.
So, based on a phone call that never was completed, never really got started, they put out a statewide alert based on how lengthy a conversation with your mom did they finally have when they got there?
I don't know, maybe 5-10 minutes. It couldn't have been longer than 5 minutes.
And does she recall giving them the distinct impression that you were a danger to yourself?
Not according to her. According to her, she said that's why she hung up the phone, because she realized that I wasn't.
But their immediate question was, does he have guns? Presumably concerned for your well-being, but my guess is that maybe at a minimum they had an additional reason for asking, if not, maybe that was the main reason for asking.
Even when I finally returned and I got back to my parents' house, they didn't have a social worker there. They didn't ask me about my mental health. They didn't ask me about my state of mind. There wasn't an ambulance. They didn't have me talk to a crisis intervention counselor. None of these things happened. The very first thing they asked me, because my mom said she didn't know where my guns were at the time, was, where are your guns? So from my point of view, it was a gun hunt from the very beginning. I don't see it as being anything other than a gun hunt.
Now, I think you were in a difficult position in view of the way they seem to think. But first of all, coming back probably could have been avoided. You might have gone you might have made it to Hoboken where you were heading, although we're not sure of that. But once you're back and they're asking you questions, now I'm sure you're abundantly aware the proper response is, I want a lawyer.
Yeah, well, I'm aware of that now. At the time, they told me that I wasn't suspected of a crime, so I didn't need a lawyer, and they didn't read me my Miranda warning, not until after interrogating me for 3 hours.
They lied, and your attorney wanted to do something about it in court. That probably could have made a difference. The music is coming upon us. I just want folks to know that I'm talking with Brian Aitken. The book that he's written is The Blue Tent Scott, and it will not make you happy. It will scare you, I hope. You have a greater determination after reading this book to fight against any and all gun control laws. We're going to be back with Brian Aitken.
The Gun Owners News Hour, the program that bears the raw truth over who controls the guns, the people or the government. Back in a moment. And now, more news about the threats to your liberties. and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again your host, Executive Director of the Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Well, thanks for being with us today, talking with Brian Aitken, who is Exhibit A on why you may not want to go through New Jersey, particularly if you're a gun owner. This is behind enemy lines, and Brian Aitken has lost a good part of his life thanks to one bad attitude after another. As we were talking coming up to the break in the first segment, Brian, you were telling us how your mother had almost made a call to 911, but they came out anyway because they ID'd the phone, and they were interviewing you after they got you back under rather false pretenses for some 3 hours without ever having read you your rights. And then they used everything in that interview and more to nail your feet to the floor. Why don't you pick up from there and take us a little way through the rest of your ordeal?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They obviously used the 3 hours worth of interrogating me as the basis to search my car. And one of the big questions that I get from a lot of people is, well, did you consent to the search? And it's a tricky question because the answer is yes and no. They told me if I didn't consent, that they would send me to a psychiatric hospital for a mandatory 72-hour hold, and told me that part of the process of that would be having my car impounded, and when they impound the car, they itemize each and everything inside of the car to make sure that you get everything back. So one way or another, they're going to search my car.
They're going to search it, but that would have made it even more clear that they were doing it in violation of your Fourth Amendment protection, because they had no probable cause to threaten something like that.
None whatsoever.
They could see with their own eyes that you were behaving as a rational person would be expected to act. You weren't delighted with what they were doing, but you were certainly not in any way giving an indication that you were a nut job. And
no, in fact, they complimented me and said, how great of a person I was and how amicable I was during the interrogation. And they said that I was polite and amicable. And I guess that's probably the problem. Maybe I shouldn't have been. Maybe I should have been more upset about all of my rights were clearly being trampled on.
Being amiable is fine, but being more guarded and realizing that these are not your friends, that's frequently a mistake that is made. And attorneys that have defense attorneys that have represented a lot of people, including gun owners, make that point, that nobody in the system is your friend. Nobody. Hopefully your attorney is, but everybody else is there because it's a job at best and perhaps a cause at worst, the cause being to lock up people like you.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is I grew up in a family where, I had a lot of members who were state and federal law enforcement officers and military, and I just always was under the presumption that these people were there to help.
That's that sick old joke, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
Yeah.
So, obviously, because they were your family, the problem is none of them were involved in your situation that day. That conceivably would have had it turn out very different. But this was a side, evidently, of law enforcement and the system in general that you'd never seen or apparently heard about, because you were just caught completely unawares. You were cooperating, and you were on your good behavior, and they were not.
I'd never even heard of anything like this happening before. I thought, I've done all of my research. I know that I'm following the law, so I really don't want to have them search my car because I don't want to have to explain what these transportation laws are.
Right.
But they're not really giving me a choice, so I guess, I'll just do what they're asking me to do. In hindsight, I never should have returned back to my parents' place. I should have just kept on driving to my apartment.
Right. because I don't know how far it would have been to your new residence, but you very possibly could have gotten there without incident.
Yeah, another half hour, and had I known what I know now, I would have known, well, they have no probable cause, there's no warrant, there's no reason for anyone to be involved in what I'm doing right now, and I could have just, gone home that night, gotten some wings, and turned on the TV and watched Comedy Central or something.
Exactly. But that's not what
Instead,
happened.
I spent the night, it was a Friday, so I spent the entire weekend in jail because you can't post bail on jail. So I spent well over 72 hours, instead of being in a psychiatric hospital like they threatened me with, in jail.
So that's how concerned they were about your mental state.
Yeah.
Not.
So concerned they never had a single healthcare professional talk to me at all. Until, of course, they were giving me my TB shot to put me in general population.
But that's part of a routine, not because they felt that they were singling you out because of some question that they had.
No, they do that for everybody.
Exactly.
So the standard fucking experience for the law-abiding citizens who has guns in New Jersey.
So you basically never saw the right side of a jail from the time you'd gone back to your mother's and you were arrested by the local Mounties.
Well, I did. So I spent the weekend there, and then I was able to post bail. One of the ironic things here is the police officer who would later say that I wasn't moving listed as a reason for giving me a very high bail amount, as my length of residence was only 3 days in New Jersey, and I had been moving. So on the bail sheet that he filled out to have a judge sign to give me a very high bail, he said, this guy is moving, he's not from New Jersey, we need to give him a very high bail so he doesn't flee, so he has an incentive to come back. And then when he later would testify in court, would testify that he never thought that I was moving.
I believe the word that is used among the profession is testifying.
Testifying, that's the one.
So this man has no conscience. He's obviously only concerned about one thing, his brownie points, his career, and he's not interested in justice.
Not at all. He was primarily interested in, after realizing that he'd made a grave error, covering his own butt.
And he was only the first of many, because there were others in the system, had they chosen to, could have seen that this didn't add up. This didn't make sense. We'll return to that point when we get back. Right now we're talking with the Blue Tent Sky author, Brian Aitken, and it's a tale of just unimaginable mistreatment by the system in New Jersey because he had 3 handguns in his trunk. Legally. We're going to be back. Don't go away.
The Gun Owners News Hour, the program that bears the raw truth over who controls the guns, the people or the government. Back in a moment. And now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again your host, Executive Director of the Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Talking with Brian Aitken, he's written a book about his ordeal in New Jersey. It's called The Blue Tent Sky. Subtitle tells you a lot more. How the Left's War on Guns Cost Me My Son and My Freedom. And it just, I've thought a lot about this book, and it's made me very glad that I don't have to go back to New Jersey. And I really feel for people that have to put up with a government that has such a socialist mentality. They're gonna just control everything, and gun control is usually front and center with that kind of a mindset. You were moving your guns. You, along with your other earthly belongings, they're all in your car. And when the guns are spotted, you're back at your mother's. They're doing a non-search warrant search. Unhappily, you had given them permission because they'd kind of cajoled you. So the question asked when the guns are seen, do you have are these guns registered? Now you knew you were, because the guy doesn't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah, and this is something, I get this question all the time from people in New Jersey, but I never expected that I would get it from a police officer, because New Jersey has no law that requires citizens to register their firearms. There's simply no requirement for gun registration. And the very first thing that the officer asked me was, well, are they registered? And I explained to him that they didn't have to be, and he looked at me like I was a liar, like I was lying to him about this. And I found myself in a strange position where I had to describe to the police officer what the laws were. And over the years, people have told me, well, the ignorance of the law is no excuse. They assumed that I was ignorant of the law, but I had just printed off what the laws were from the New Jersey State Police website. I had already talked to a New Jersey State Police officer who was in charge of firearms for the state, and I knew what they were, and I found myself with a few local police officers who had no idea. And, to be honest, they were the ones that were ignorant. So there's only ignorance of the law is no excuse unless you're a police officer.
Yeah, a lot of things are excused if you're a police officer, evidently. So did you show him what you had printed off?
I did. I had on me, I believe I had my FBI background check, the ATF check, just, some print-offs that I'd gotten when I had purchased my firearms. And a printout that showed the New Jersey State Police banner from their website and the exemptions that say you don't need a permit if you're doing X, Y, and Z. And I showed him that clearly I'm doing one of these things, and that's specifically moving from one house to another, and so I don't need a concealed carry permit right now. He wanted to err on the side of safety and, in his own words, let a judge figure that out.
That is such an irresponsible thing to say. He has, we got in my dream world, we're going to fire everybody that isn't going to uphold his oath of office, which is to protect the Constitution. If he's going to turn it over to a politician in robes, then he doesn't deserve to wear a badge.
I feel exactly the same way. The unfortunate thing, there was one police officer there who wasn't the arresting officer, and he was sympathetic to me, and I could tell that he knew that what I was saying had some truth to it. I could tell that he was a little worried about it, but I could tell that he was on my side. He actually took the guns from the arresting officer, walked them up to my parents' house, and gave them to my dad, and said, if you can just put them in your house safe for the night, Brian can come back and get them tomorrow. And my dad came to the front door, told the police officer, I tried to put them in the safe. They didn't fit. What else can we do? And that's when Officer Joy called back to the supervising officer, and that officer just said, well, just arrest him then.
So your dad actually wasn't aware of just how messed up these cops were, because had he had any inkling, he would have said sure, and he could have put him under his bed or something, That would have been
my dad's brother was a Philadelphia police officer for 23 years. He retired as a watch commander. He used to teach firearm instruction at the Philadelphia Police Academy. He trusted police officers, and so did I. And not just my worldview, but my father, everyone in my family, the way that we look at police officers now has completely changed.
And, what I hope people will take away from our conversation in this show is not that the cops are the enemy, but there may be one who's either an enemy or a jerk or both. And be polite, but stay on your guard. And remember that if the cop is your enemy, everything you say can and will be used against you. And even maybe things you don't even say. So you've got to be extremely careful when you're dealing with the police, because you just might draw the dim bulb that you did, Brian.
It's true. And it's difficult for me because obviously I have a lot of friends and family in law enforcement, and just going through this experience has changed so much for me. I still get a little panicky whenever I drive by a police officer, even though I'm not doing anything wrong. It still raises my blood pressure, and it's like, man, I'm glad I'm not in New Jersey.
Exactly. Yeah, well, you weren't doing anything wrong the day you got arrested and ended up in the clink for, what was it, 3 years?
I was actually in prison for 4 months. I was sentenced to 7 years in prison with a mandatory minimum of 3 years in prison.
Okay. Now, at the trial, your attorney apparently didn't know a whole lot more about gun laws in New Jersey than did the arresting officer.
Well, my first lawyer didn't, and he got rid of me as a client because I refused to take a plea deal and just admit to a crime that I didn't commit. I was left high and dry without a lawyer, and eventually I found a lawyer who had written 4 books on New Jersey gun law, and she knew the laws really well. But the judge and the prosecutor did not like how much they knew the law, or that I had already been on television talking about my case, because after I was left high and dry by my first lawyer, I was out of money and out of a lawyer and found myself in between a rock and a hard space, and I had to go. My only real decision, my last resort, was going public with what had happened to me and hoping that somebody would step in and help. And that's how I found my lawyer.
That's Evan Knappen, as I recall, who's a rather well-known firearms attorney in New Jersey. He's, as you say, literally written a book on state laws. So, but if, as good an attorney as Evan is, if the prosecutor and the judge are incompetent and hostile, both, it's hard to imagine any attorney being able to rescue you from a situation like that. So, anyway, to remind everybody, talking today with Brian Aitken, served time in jail for having a gun, literally having him in his trunk, transporting him legally in the state of New Jersey. That's the problem, where they don't like you to have a gun, no matter what. The Blue Tent Sky is the name of the book. You might want to get it to convince yourself not to move to New Jersey. We're going to be back shortly. Don't go away.
The program that bears the raw truth over who controls the guns, the people or the government. Back in a moment. And now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here, once again, your host, Executive Director of the Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Well, my guest today is Brian Aitken, author of The Blue Tent Sky, How the Left's War on Guns Cost Me My Son and My Freedom. We've taken you up to this point, folks. Let's just go right to the trial because we're going to be running out of time. The trial was a really disgusting example of judicial activism. Brian, why don't you give us an example of what I just said?
Yeah, so we spent the first couple of days really talking about how I'd been moving from one house to another. Everybody testified to it, including the police officer and all of the state's witnesses. After all of that was said and done, and it was time for the judge to tell the jury what to deliberate on, he told them all they were allowed to consider was whether or not I possessed firearms. They weren't allowed to consider the federal Firearm Owners Protection Act that would have exonerated me because I was traveling from one state to another where my ownership was legal. Right. And they also weren't allowed to consider the state exemptions that say you don't need a concealed carry permit if you're moving from one house to another, or if you're going from your house to go shooting at a range, or to go hunting, or from the place of purchase back to your house. He decided that he was above the law, and he was going to tell the jury what to do.
And he misinformed them royally, so that, and in fact, as you detail in the book, they could smell a rat, and they came back twice asking for clarification, and twice he said, "Do as I say, not as the law says," in so many words.
Even worse, the jury came back 3 times They came back 3 times asking specifically for the exemptions that would have exonerated me, and the judge denied them those exemptions all 3 times.
The judge actually, in a biblical system, the judge would be in jail for twice what he sentenced you. And that is just so completely and openly criminal, what he did. And biblically, you are supposed to get twice what you would have meted out to the other person. So it's just stunning that this. Now, ultimately, the guy didn't get reappointed by Governor Christie, so there was at least a small amount of justice meted out to this cretin. But he never spent a day in jail. That just stinks. So, in fact, were it not for talk radio, you could very well still have been in jail right now.
Probably. There's a radio program specifically in New Jersey called the Dennis and Michelle Show, and they have millions of listeners. And he really made it a personal cause to help spread the word, and that led to well over 100,000 people writing letters to the governor, calling the governor's office. Taking to any means that they possibly could while I sat in prison, asking the governor to free me from prison.
There were so many calls coming in at one point that the phone lines got shut down?
Yeah. I think that might have been on my birthday, actually. They had set up a call to action day, and so many people called that they shut the lines down.
I don't remember if you dealt with it, but a question has to come up. The state police were not allowed to testify, or that your attorney didn't bring them in. But it seems to me that somebody from the state police could say, "Oh yeah, that's what the law is. That's what we got up on our website."
Oh, it was horrible. We didn't think that we'd need to, because we could just bring in my conversation with the state police as evidence, and then we actually had the printouts from the state police website that we wanted to enter as evidence. And the judge tried at every single attempt to deny that evidence from the record. So the evidence of the phone call that took place was stricken from the record, and the jury wasn't even allowed to know that I had called the state police.
Or that you had that printout and all of that. That's incredible. Well, the good news is that talk radio obviously showed its muscle. Now, you eventually were sprung. I guess Christie got so much heat that he felt that he had enough political wind at his back that he could take the risk of letting a convicted felon out. But he didn't give you clemency, which would have said you never should have been there, you're innocent. He gave you a pardon. Do I have that right?
Kind of. So it's complex. He commuted my sentence to time served and let me out after I spent 4 months in prison. He didn't pardon me for the crimes, and I didn't ask him to, because I didn't want to be forgiven for a crime that I had not committed. I wanted to be let out so that I would be able to fight the convictions through the appellate division. And he did exactly what I asked him to do. And the appeal was mostly successful. The appellate division determined that the judge was in the wrong and that the judge should have told the jury what the laws were. And so they overturned the conviction of illegal possession of firearms. They also overturned and dismissed the conviction of illegal possession of high-capacity magazines, which, let's be honest, are really just standard capacity magazines.
Right.
But they upheld the conviction of illegal possession of hollow point ammunition. What they decided was that in New Jersey, there's all these exemptions that say you can take your guns from the store that you buy them at to your house, from your house to go hunting, from your house to go to the shooting range, or from your house to another house when you're moving. Hollow points have all of the same exemptions, except they don't have the one that says you can take them from one house to another when you're moving. So they decided that I was guilty of illegal possession of hollow points because I was moving them from one house to another. So the law in New Jersey, as it stands right now because of the appellate division's decision, is that if a law-abiding citizen moves from one house to another, if it's legally owned hollow point ammunition, they are committing a fourth-degree felony. What they're supposed to do is leave the hollow points at their prior house after they've sold it. As my lawyer, Evan Knappen, says, leave a nice note with a bottle of champagne and all of your hollow point ammunition for the next person to get. No common sense resolution in New Jersey for gun owners.
Just amazing. Well, the thing that really encouraged me out of this whole ordeal was the power of talk radio, that when that talk show host took up your cause, that's why you and I are able to talk right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I would not be a free man right now if it wasn't for Dennis Malloy getting the word out to millions of listeners who got the word out to the governor. So
there's a guy that when we have an awards banquet, ought to have his name on a mighty fine award, because he did what the system otherwise was not going to allow to happen. What that judge and prosecutor were up to is scurrilous. And the prosecutor, I guess, was appointed by Christie. Is that correct?
I'm not exactly sure how that works. The judge wasn't. I believe a Democrat named John Corzine actually approved that judge, and certainly approved the former Attorney General who wrote very, very strict guidelines telling prosecutors to go after gun owners as strictly and uniformly as possible, and vigorously, strictly, uniformly, and vigorously, as if gun owners were violent criminals just because they owned guns.
I now recall that, in fact, Christie does appoint the prosecutors, and that was some of the leverage we had of all the contacts that were being made with his office. Well, as it turns out, we've run out of time, so we still got another few seconds. Just want to repeat the name of the book, The Blue Tent Sky, and in so many words, it's the ordeal of Brian Aitken, an unhappy ex-wife and a miserable system in New Jersey took a big bite out of your life, and you can't see your son because your wife's moved out of state, and you've got a felony record. You can't rent any place. Good job there, New Jersey. We really appreciate you. Brian, thanks so much. I'm glad that you're still able to walk and talk.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. I appreciate you having me on the show today.
You bet.
The Gun Owners News Hour is hosted by Gun Owners of America's Executive Director, Larry Pratt. Be sure to join us here again next week. And remember, it's not just about